So this is going to be a short history of the U.S. dollar. So the U.S. dollar has only been around since, the modern U.S. dollar has only been around since 1971. The Federal Reserve note. If you take out a dollar bill, you'll see at the very top it says Federal Reserve note. So this is a Federal Reserve note. So is that what money is? Federal Reserve notes? The almighty dollar. So I want to give a short history about the U.S. dollar. The Nixon shock in 1971 changed what the U.S. dollar was. There have been lots of different paper currencies and banknotes, and there was colonial governments. There was a continental. They were issued in the very beginning of our history, but they didn't catch on. They were only there for just the government project. So, for instance, the War of 1812, there were some, I think, treasury notes that were issued, but then, and it's kind of like money, but then once the War of 1812 was over, then they just bought all those treasury bills back, or all those treasury notes back, and then took them out of circulation. So they were only in circulation for a short amount of time. So I want to talk about the U.S. dollar in the context of the Federal Reserve, since they just got $500 billion, and they like to print up dollars whenever the hell they feel like it. So the Federal Reserve, there's 12 regional branches of the Federal Reserve banks throughout the country. So you got the main Federal Reserve Board, who heads all of it in D.C., but then you got 12 regional branch federal banks throughout the country. Most of them are towards the east. I believe mine is for the west. The west has like a dozen states only has one Federal Reserve branch. But I'm here in Colorado, so my Federal Reserve branch, the branch is in Kansas City. So the 16th Amendment is going to pass the same time that the Federal Reserve is passed, in 1913. It's over 107 years ago. So 16th Amendment, this is after the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the Civil War Amendments, is going to pass Congress in 1909. Then it's going to get 3/4 of the states to ratify it by February 25th, 1913. And 3 candidates in the 1912 election had supported an income tax, and then William Howard Taft is going to declare and sign the 16th Amendment into law right at the end of his tenure. The 16th Amendment's language is, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So that's an amendment, right? So that's, 3/4. You had to get Congress, you had to get 3/4 of all the states to pass. So this amends the Constitution. Before, you couldn't have an income tax because of apportionment or something. Now you can have an income tax, apportionment be damned. So on December 23rd, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, 1913, Congress is going to create the Fed by passing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And Woodrow Wilson is going to sign it into law. This is 6 years after the Panic of 1907. There was an inflexibility to money and inelasticity of credit during the Panic of 1907, according to this guy here, John Morton Bloom, Woodrow Wilson. So the panic was bad, right? It's a depression. But he says that the specific reason was you needed, some money needed liquidity, and then credit needed to have some elasticity. But you didn't see that in the Panic in 1907. So 1907, there's a depression, and then 1913, 6 years later, you're going to have the income tax. You're going to have and the Federal Reserve is going to pass 6 years after that, after the Panic. So the Panic in 1907 had a lot to do with the income tax and the 16th Amendment and the Federal Reserve itself to getting it passed. Wall Street and a lot of big financiers and bankers and shit was actually opposed to the federal government, and Woodrow Wilson wanted to have this decentralized system where you have 12 regional branches, you know, the federal banks throughout the country, but then you have the Federal Reserve that heads all of it out of D.C. And then the head of the Federal Reserve, I think all of these 7 members of the ruling board of governors are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. So there's 7 members on the board, the ruling board of governors, the executive branch in Washington, D.C. Jerome Powell is the current chair of the Federal Reserve right now. And Donald Trump once said that Jerome Powell is a bigger threat to the United States than China is. And Donald's the one who nominated him. And Donald's the one who just gave the Secretary of Treasury and the Fed $500 billion. So I'm not for sure if that's a good idea there, Donald. The bigger threat to America than China, you're going to give them $500 billion of free cash money to do as the hell they want to do? The U.S. Department of Treasury prints the currency used. So who prints the currency? The Department of the Treasury, in case you ever go on Jeopardy. So 12 regional branches of the federal bank, 1 Federal Reserve Board, 7 members to the Federal Reserve Board, all nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. U.S. Department of Treasury prints the currency. They print the paper money. Now, who comes up with the monetary policy of the United States? Well, it's the Fed, but more specifically, it's the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, the FOMC. So the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, sets the monetary policy of the U.S. This Federal Open Market Committee, this FOMC, consists of all 7 members of the Fed's Board of Governors, plus the 12 regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents, although only 5 regional bank presidents may vote at a time. So, you have 7 plus 12, but only 5 of them have voting power, so 7 plus 5, 12 people set the monetary policy of the U.S., those who are part of the Federal Open Market Committee. Now, let's talk about money, cash money. The Constitution explicitly prohibits the states from issuing bills of credit and coining money. The states could only make silver and gold legal tender. So specifically, bills of credit, which is what a Federal Reserve note is, a bill of credit, and coining money. So the states can't do this. How can the states pay their obligations to the federal government? Only 2 ways, silver and gold. That's the Constitution. The Constitution says only silver and gold are legal tender. But then some Supreme Court cases saying, well, that's just restricting the states. It's not restricting the federal government. Of course the federal government can print up a bunch of commercial paper and bills of credit and lots of legal financial fictions. So the Constitution, I think, is important because that's where all the laws come from, and we have an income tax, you know, that wasn't part of the Constitution. We have paper money. We have the, you know, Congress doesn't have war powers anymore. So we've gotten, you know, very far away from the Constitution. But I think it's remarkable that the states are forbidden from issuing paper money, essentially, with the bills of credit or coining their own money, so they can't take silver and gold and then, you know, punch coins out of them. And they had to use silver and gold as legal tender anyways. So that's the Constitution, right? The greatest document that none of the Americans have ever... They worship the Constitution, but they don't know what the hell the damn thing says. So let's talk about money. Let's talk about money. Now it's the Federal Reserve note. Today it's the Federal Reserve note, but it used to be called a U.S. note. It also was called a demand note. Legal tender note. So the U.S. note was the legal tender note for the longest time. You had the demand notes. That was the first paper currency in America that gained wide circulation. So the demand notes probably, you could say, were the first greenbacks, and they were all greenbacks starting in 1861, 1862. So the demand notes, they are the first issuance of paper money that gained wide circulation. They're extremely rare today. The demand notes, this is Abraham Lincoln, they're worth more than the $5, $10, and $20 denominations given out during the beginning of the Civil War. Now, the demand notes only lasted for 1 year, 1861 to 1862, and then they're going to have the U.S. note is going to be created in 1862. Now, the reason why the demand note and the U.S. note were called greenbacks when they were first issued, Abraham Lincoln's money was called the greenback. Oh, you want those greenbacks? It was because the Confederate paper money, they were blank on the back side. But Abraham Lincoln's money had a picture and it had green ink. So they called it a greenback because it had, ink on the back, and that ink was green. So old greenback jacks, the candy corn, that's what we call, our money today, greenbacks. Old greenback jacks is what I call them because, I'm cool like that. The U.S. note is also legal tender note. If you look at, again, go back to your trusty almighty dollar, you got Federal Reserve note at the top, and then you have this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now, before we used to get, $1 worth of gold out of this, but I don't even know if we could even buy $1 worth of gold with, this damn dollar. Existing U.S. notes are still valid currency in the U.S. So since 1862 to 1971, America issued paper money. In 1862, this is big. So between the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and the Civil War, let's go before the Civil War, the U.S. government didn't issue paper money as it's known today, but it did on many occasions issue short-term debt called Treasury notes, but they were not considered legal tender. So this is Treasury notes. The Spanish dollar used to be widely circulated in the 13 colonies. The Spanish dollar, this is silver dollars of the Catholic monarchs after 1497. So they started printing all these silver Spanish dollars after 1497. They were also known as a piece of 8, also known as a peso. But the Spanish dollar was the first international currency, and the Spanish dollar remained legal in the United States until the Coinage Act of 1857. So the Spanish dollar was probably the most, the most trusted and relied upon international currency or fiat currency or medium of exchange during the 13 colony days. And because we use the Spanish dollar during the beginning, that's why we go by the dollar today instead of the pound. Even though we're British, we're English of British descent, but we don't have pounds and we don't have whatever pences and shillings. Instead, we have dollars and pennies and nickels. So the Spanish dollar influenced us to get a dollar and not a pound. The British Parliament passed Currency Acts 1751, 1764, 1773 that regulated colonial paper money. So while they were using the Spanish dollar, the colonial governments themselves were printing up their own paper money. They were using their own currency. Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be the first in the Western world to issue paper currency. The paper bills used by the colonial state governments were known as bills of credit. And bills of credit, just like the U.S. dollar today, is fiat currency, which means that it's not exchangeable for any guaranteed gold, silver, or any other commodity. It's not backed by anything other than the illusion that both you and I pretend that it has value. So Massachusetts Bay Colonies printing up their own money. Pennsylvania paper currency is secured by land. So Pennsylvania, Massachusetts are printing up their own money. Pennsylvania's paper currency is secured by land, and it's going to hold its value against gold from 1723 to 1775. So because it was backed by land versus gold, it maintained its worth for, a good 52 years. So the Massachusetts pound, they, used pounds back in the colonial days, but the Massachusetts pound wasn't worth the same as the Pennsylvania pound, having all these different governments issue all these different currencies. Clearly, that is a problem. Even Adam Smith, the great Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, the great Adam Smith, in his, most influential, the Wealth of Nations, all, economics comes from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He criticized the colonial bills of credit. Look at them damn colonies print up their own money. You know, their monopoly money. Yeah, sure, we'll take that monopoly money. What are you going to pay us next then? Wampum? A bunch of seashells? What's next? Tobacco and beaver? Actually, tobacco and beaver are better. Beaver skins and tobacco and wampum were commodities used as currency in the early U.S. history. So wampum are just shells, so that's a medium of exchange. They, might be pretty amongst themselves, but tobacco and beaver skins are actual commodities that could be used, right, for clothing and carpet and tobacco to smoke. So this is backed by commodities, which makes me think of cannabis coin. Cannabis coin is actually backed by marijuana. So every cannabis coin you have, you get a gram of marijuana. So it's tied to the price of cannabis. I think you should actually have a digital coin that's backed by gold and marijuana. But we have the fiat currency. The American dollar has just been, elevated all by itself. It's the world's reserve currency. So we still, have that distinction, which helps us economically. It leans the economic, situation in our favor. Now, the colonies, they had denominations of pounds, shillings, and pences. Like I said before, the Spanish dollar was widely circulated, and eventually the U.S. dollar is formed because of the Spanish dollar and not the pound. The Continental Congress as well had issued continental dollars between 1775 and 1779 to help finance the U.S. Revolution. The paper continental dollars were supposed to be equal to the Spanish milled dollars, but they were never redeemed in silver, and they lost 99% of their value by 1790 despite the American victory. So back in the colonial days, back in the days of the Revolution, they're circulating these continentals to raise money for the military. So they're passing out all these continentals that they expect the people to pretend has value and wealth, but meanwhile they expect silver and gold to be paid for them. So the continental, there's an old saying, that ain't worth a continental. That right there ain't worth a continental. So you could criticize Massachusetts, criticize Pennsylvania for printing up their own bills of credit, as Adam Smith did in his Wealth of Nations. So you can go ahead and criticize Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, but the continental wasn't worth jack shit. So the Pennsylvania bills of credit, the money of Pennsylvania colony and Massachusetts were stronger than the continental. So America wins, but somehow the money isn't going to have any value by 1790. During the Revolutionary War, $242 million of continentals were issued, and they were issued in weird denominations such as 1/6 of a dollar, 1/3 of a dollar, $80. State bills of credit were being issued alongside of continentals, and there's just too many of all of it, right? Too many continentals, too many different state bills of credit, nothing was on the same. They tied it all to the Spanish dollar, so basically America was just banking on foreign speculation. Should have used the continentals to pay the taxes. They could have bought back bonds from the government, but instead, basically everybody that invested in the continentals, like that would be traumatic as fuck. Give all your money for continentals and then go around and say, hey, I got all these continentals, and they just laugh at you and then walk away. It's like if you had, money. If I walked up and then people said, but that dollar, that's a continental. We ain't gonna accept that dollar here. You ain't gonna accept this dollar here. Well, what the fuck am I gonna do? That's all I have is a bunch of cash. All I got is these pieces of paper that say, they're debt, right? This is debt. No, this pays debt. This is legal tender. This isn't debt. Well, it's a Federal Reserve note, so it's kind of debt. Anyways, they dealt with that before. So the Treasury prints up the money, and then the Federal Reserve buys the money from the Treasury at 95 cents to a dollar. So the Treasury makes 95 cents per dollar, right? Costs a nickel to print up a dollar, and they sell the dollar probably at face value to the Fed. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but somebody's making a shit ton of money by just printing up money, just printing it up, right? But it's not just printing it up. Quantitative easing takes a long time eventually for somebody's got to make the decision, and it happened 3 times in 2008, and it's going to happen again, but it's not going to happen for student debts or for the poor or for homelessness. It's going to be for Wall Street. So we're going to give trillions of dollars to Wall Street when the Federal Reserve was supposed to stop the big moneyed interest in Wall Street, help the common man out. It's decentralized to make sure that a bunch of fucking bankers aren't just running America into the ground for their own personal private wealth. So also another big issue was the British were successful in printing up counterfeit Continentals on a large scale. So the fucking British, man, I don't know why we have, this great friendship with the British. We overthrew them in the Revolution. And the War of 1812, they burnt down our White House. During the Revolution, they're sitting there printing up a bunch of counterfeit Continentals on a large scale to, breed dissension and confusion amongst the colonials in America. And it worked, right? The Continental eventually is going to be worthless in just 15 years. Hey, I got a Continental. Fuck you. That ain't shit. I got a pile of dog shit in my hand. And I got something that has more value. The Founding Fathers embedded in the Constitution no enumerated provision for a national paper currency, and states have to pay their debts in gold and silver, not bills of credit, not coins, but gold and silver, not their own coinage from copper, but it must have been silver and gold. In the 1884 Juilliard v. Greenman decision, this is an 8-1 SCOTUS decision. It settled the debate by saying the Constitution didn't forbid the federal government from printing currency, just the state governments. So, whew, right, the American government missed the bullet there. It was like, oh shit, no, we weren't just forbidding America. We were forbidding the state governments. America could go ahead and print all the goddamn money in the world. Justice Field, the dissent in the 1884 Juilliard v. Greenman Supreme Court case, Justice Field, his dissent is incredible. He quotes James Madison, saying that the pretext for paper currency, particularly for making the bills a tender either for public or private debts, was cut off. Therefore, saying the federal government can't print up paper currency because James Madison once said that they cut off that power. No, the federal government can't print up paper currency. We cut that power away from them. So they wrote the Constitution and then went around lying about it. But Justice Field's dissent's incredible because it just gives you a sense of what they thought about money, back in 1884. Nixon's going to take us off the gold standard. FDR is going to have a gold recall, order all Americans to give up the gold that they had, even would fine you $10,000. 10 years in jail if you didn't give up all the gold that you had, because we had to back our money with gold. But this because we've been, using our indicators, our, pillars, our measuring, our economic measurements. We compare and contrast them to the international scene instead of just, comparing it to ourselves. Is this working for us? Is it not? Let's do something different. So, yeah, Treasury notes, they were first issued during the War of 1812, and they were issued irregularly up through the Civil War after that. Treasury notes bore interest in varied market conditions, and they completely disappeared from the financial system after the crisis associated with their issuance had ended. So, Treasury notes used to be, we got Federal Reserve notes, but Treasury notes was kind of like cash, and it was used as cash, but it was different because once the War of 1812 was financed, then they pulled the Treasury notes out of circulation. So that's a little bit better that they buy the notes back versus the Continentals, where if you just, bought into the fiction of a Continental, of, that old U.S. dollar, then you lost your ass. You lost everything that you put into it. So you gave money in gold. You gave up your Spanish dollar for a Continental. Are you fucking stupid? Why would you do that? One is made up of pure silver. The other one is just a piece of paper. So small treasury notes were issued in 1815. Total $3.4 million were issued for the War of 1812, and then they were rapidly exchanged for bonds. So the treasury notes was also used for the Panic of 1837. So the Panic is a depression. The War of 1812 and the U.S. Civil War. Compound interest treasury notes. This is just, a treasury note with some oomph. This is a compound interest treasury note. They were authorized in 1863 and 1864, and in theory, these treasury notes didn't contribute to inflation as much as the greenbacks, the original demand notes, did. So there's a greenback party in the 1870s and 1880s. They wanted more greenbacks printed up and put into the U.S. economy. There was also a free silver movement that was happening in the 1870s, late 1800s. They wanted more silver coins to be printed up and, thrust into the U.S. economy. So a lot of people call these the cheap money people, but I think both of these are good ideas today. I mean, that's what we're doing today, is just printing up more greenbacks, right? I think we can have, the states are supposed to pay their debts with gold and silver. Even though I don't see silver and gold all around, I think silver and gold's a pretty good backstop for the dollar today. I think the dollar, there's a lot of confidence in the dollar today, probably because of the Federal Reserve and all these crazy machinations and whatnot, what have you. But the Greenback Party and the Free Silver Movement wanted the same thing. They wanted cheaper money to help the workers, to help the farmers out. They wanted to essentially devalue, gold. They wanted to devalue gold and make paper money and make silver money just as solid as gold was. And gold has always, wasn't it? No, silver. Jesus got sold out for 30 pieces of silver. But silver and gold's been traded for a long time. And gold, I think you should always better bank on gold. Gold is, for the longest time, if you're a conservative, you didn't want greenbacks, you didn't want silver coins, you just wanted gold because the conservative said that's sound money. You need sound money, and sound money comes from gold. Now, there's a lot of excuses against gold. People say there's not enough gold for a world economy. The gold supply doesn't grow fast enough to support the growth. Gold has no yield, tax-deferred compounding. Gold causes Great Depressions. Gold has no intrinsic value. It's a metal, not just a rock. Gold is a barbarous relic. Gold, you could attach it to the dollar, $10,000 an ounce, 33,000 tons of gold. They keep mining brand new gold. Gold would be okay, but since the U.S. dollar, it's conservative now. So Nixon was a liberal in taking us off the gold standard. FDR was a liberal in calling up all these gold reserves and putting it into Fort Knox. Abraham Lincoln was a liberal by printing up, paper money. So all these liberal, tactics at the time. Today, 2020, it's conservative to stay off the gold standard and to back the U.S. dollar, the U.S. greenback, and let it be fiat currency because it's worked for such a long time. Even though there's a ton of issues associated with that, the conservative position is to let's stick with the greenback, and we don't need to back it with silver and gold. We don't need to print up more silver coins. We may need to print up more paper, currency, but we got to do it. We can't just print it up, pell-mell, willy-nilly, whenever the fuck we feel like it. We have to print it up with, during times when they need to be printed up. I mean, some shit dollars, people, they get destroyed and irretrievably lost. So you may print out $1 million, but what happens when, people drop 100,000 of them? So now you have less money supply. That contracts the money supply, less money. It raises the value of the money, but it's not good for the economy because people are holding on to the money instead of circulating them. So that's some history about U.S. money, U.S. dollar. The Continental probably was the first paper dollar, right? But it fucking failed. They had, denominations of 1/4, 1/6 of a dollar. So the Continental was called a dollar back then. Then the demand notes They called them greenbacks, so they didn't call it a dollar. They called them a demand note. That's when the dollar, the modern dollar, today's dollar,